Hey everybody, this is Gabe Hernandez with Comical Opinions. Wanted to talk about a little bit about this thread that came up from Gerry Conway, who is a longtime DC and Marvel comics writer. He recently appeared on the Word Balloon podcast with John Suntress. If you don't know that podcast, I would highly recommend it. John's sort of an elder statesman when it comes to radio and podcasting, audio broadcasting in general. He's been around forever. All the pros know him for years, in some cases decades. And it's a long form interview type podcast where he gets creators on, and sometimes they go for an hour or two. Usually the longer ones are the more insightful, but usually an hour or two at the most. And Gerry Conway came on his podcast recently, and they talked about a number of different topics. And then as a result of that conversation, and sometimes those interviews are also streamed live on YouTube, so people have a chance to join in the chat and ask and answer questions. After that, Gerry Conway came on Twitter and kind of put together a little bit of a thread that is somewhat a bit of an indictment against the mainstream comics publishers because of how they're going after market audiences, how they're maintaining the existing comics, the monthly comics model. Usually, let's just settle this right from the get-go. When I say the word comics, I'm talking about monthly comics. If I mean graphic novels, I'll say graphic novels. If I'm talking about trades, I'll say trades. If I say comics, I'm not talking about everything that has a graphical and a textual element to it that is published under the sun. I think too many fans, pros, analysts, pundits, whatever, they're too loose with the use of the word comics. When I say comics, I'm talking about monthly comics, usually floppies. If I mean a graphic novel or trade, I'll say graphic novel trade. So let's get that straight up right up front. The comics industry, or comics just as a product, are not doing well right now. They're just not. I mean, anybody that would want to argue against that, I'm happy to have that debate with you, but they're just not. So we just have to take a look at all the different aspects that go into what constitutes and how monthly comics are getting made, why they're not growing, why their sales last year were stagnant, why their sales this year are much worse than stagnant. And Gerry Conway, as a result of that interview, came along and put together this Twitter thread. And I wanted to step through it because I thought it was very interesting. If you're not familiar with Gerry Conway, here's their handy dandy Wikipedia page. He's been writing since forever. He's not a young gentleman, but he has been writing comics a very long time. If you take a look at the number of different titles he's written for, everything from, look, you got Action Comics, Adventure Comics, Atari Force. Ooh, that's going back a ways. House of Mystery, Freedom Fighters, Firestorm. I definitely remember his Firestorm run, so that was a lot of fun because he was right there from the beginning. Everybody from Man Bat to Metal Men to even Tarzan, Superman titles for sure. That's just for Disney. I'm sorry, for DC. Then you've got Disney, First Comics, which I don't think they're even around anymore. And then you have Marvel Comics. I mean, you've got everything under sun. So if you name it, he's had at least some tangential exposure to it, if not wholly on the title for a very long time. So when it comes to making monthly comics, Gerry Conway knows what he's talking about. He's been there, done that. So let's take a look at the thread. We're just going to step through it real quick. I'll provide some commentary along the way. This is not to necessarily strongly advocate for Gerry's position or strongly go against it, but I thought it was just interesting to get a different perspective, and we can work through it together. So here's first comment, talking with John at the Word Balloon, which again is the Word Balloon podcast. Please seek that out. I think it's very informative. On YouTube Live yesterday, we had what I would do if I ran the world conversation. Let's get down a little bit. To state the obvious, comic book publishing is in serious trouble. Again, comic books, we're talking about monthlies, with a business model that almost literally has no future. Yet comic books are a source of intellectual property for exploitation in all sorts of popular media, and have never had, I think he meant to say, greater potential. So why is this? Why do comics as a storytelling form, superhero and otherwise, have such an enormous impact in popular culture, but comic book publishers are struggling to survive? Why are publishers almost universally failing to succeed at actual publishing? Now, this comment is interesting because this is an insider. This is, I think it would be reasonable to say, a legend, somebody who has seen pretty much everything you can imagine in the past 40 to 50 years. And even he is stating outright that the publishers are almost universally failing to succeed at actual publishing. My basic answer is they're pursuing the wrong market, and they've been doing so with increasing desperation since the late 1970s. Okay, here's where it gets very interesting. Let's put aside the incredible business stupidity of depending on a single distribution method, which means direct sales to single audience comic book stores. That's your local comic book shop. And he's saying basically single point of failure is not smart. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. The problem is bigger. The defined audience for mainstream comics is an audience that by definition constantly shrinks. Okay, so I won't comment on that one just yet, and I'm sort of taken aback a little bit by that statement. But let's see how he expands on that point before I get too much into the commentary. For a variety of self-enforcing reasons, publishers have defined the primary audience for mainstream comics as, in effect, long-term fans and potential collectors. Hence, fan-oriented, navel-gazing continuity, tri-annual events, reboots, collector-oriented variant covers, etc. So essentially, it's a speculator's market is what they're going after. People who look at comics as an investment is part of that in a significant way. Possibly what he's implying here is almost in a too significant way. Every single one of these marketing ploys is designed solely to appeal to existing readers. Okay. Not necessarily anything wrong with that, but I can see where that can establish sort of a blinders or tunnel blindness, if you will. Even reboots ostensibly intended to offer jumping on points to new readers actually require familiarity with previous iterations to provide interest. I would agree with that. My biggest example for that one was when DC rebooted into the New 52. I remember one of the talking points that was touted very aggressively was it making the books more accessible. It's a good starting point for new readers. And then I went into the comic book shop and I was picking up, and I wanted to pick up, say, Green Lantern. I love Green Lantern. My son loves Green Lantern, actually. And I picked up that first issue and I leafed through it and I was like, what the heck is this? It doesn't establish any of the origin that you could really grasp onto. And I remember the first couple of pages, there was a bunch of aliens that got decapitated. I was like, and my son was much younger then, but I was like, I can't give this to my son. How is this accessible? How is this a good starting point? I mean, I know that's very anecdotal. It's very much that one specific example, but it was when they were touting accessibility and a good starting point, a good jumping on point. And I picked this book up and it was like, it's not appropriate for new readers. It's definitely not appropriate for younger readers. And it's like, okay, so how is this accessible? It wasn't clear. So, and that's just maybe my failing for understanding what they meant by that, but that's just how it came across. New readers aren't welcomed by the existing creative strategy at the two mainstream publishers. I would say that's fair. If anything, new readers are actively discouraged by the publisher's frantic pursuit of motivated existing readership. The clubhouse is closed. Stay out. Maybe. I'm not sure I understand exactly what he's going by, how they're motivated. I understand being motivated by existing readership, but I don't know necessarily that it excludes or makes a conscious effort to exclude new readers. I think it's just a question of not considering how new readers read. I think it's more of a barrier born out of ignorance rather than intention, but we'll see how that goes. Publishers, of course, will disagree with this analysis and say they're always trying to provide on-ramps to new readers. I would disagrry with that, but okay. No, I mean, I agree with Gerry, what he's saying. I would disagree that if a publisher came by and said they're always looking for on-ramps, I don't think they either don't do it very well or they're intentionally not doing it. But any serious look at what they're offering in the main reveals a decided tilt, in fact, a massive tilt toward privileging the existing readership. Okay, I agree with that to an extent, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And this makes sense in a way because of a cultural creative shift in the editorial direction of the publishing houses that can be traced back to the era I'm from, the late 1960s and early 70s. Okay, and this is where his long career history really comes into play. In the mid-1960s, around 1967, DC Comics offered a weekly tour of their offices during the summer. Okay, that's great. I went on the tour, and like others, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman among them became a regular. At one point, I had a conversation with the then editor, Julie Schwartz. We were talking about a Green Lantern story, and I made some fanboy comment about what I hoped would happen. Julie paused, looked at me. How old are you? 14? I said. He snorted, too old. You're not my reader. And he walked off. I later learned that at DC and also at Marvel in the 1960s, the commonly accepted view of the comic book readership was a kid, undoubtedly male, between the age of 9 and 13, what today's publishers would call middle grade readers. This makes sense. If we're honest about it, the basic root appeal of this superhero stories is to that part of ourselves that lives in a pre-sexualized, pre-adolescent dream state in which anything is possible. It's the world of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. In the earlier years of comics, and I mean in the time frame he's talking about, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 80s, I would agree with that. Like Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone, if you want to be pedantic, young adults and adults can enjoy superhero stories too, and even want those stories to evolve and mature just as the Potter books evolved and matured. But regardless of what appeal the first Potter book might have had for older and existing readers, its primary readership was intended to be and remains middle grade, 8 through 12. Okay. And at the same time, the same used to be true for comics, particularly superhero comics, until my generation came along. Okay. And this is where he kind of takes it on. Yeah, we boomers effed it up as usual. When I and my cohorts replaced the creatives who given the comic book business massive success in the 60s, folks like Stan Lee and Julie Schwartz, we brought with us our boomer self-obsession. We didn't want to create comics for kids. We wanted comics for us. Okay, and so here's where we get an interesting bent on that. That's the origin of comic book superhero shift from middle grade readership in the 60s to young adult readership in the 70s and adult readership in the 90s and beyond. Okay, and I definitely see that timeline jives with what he's saying. The refusal of boomer creatives and editors like myself and others to let it go. We redefined the readership comics were aimed at, coinciding with a shift in distribution that allowed that redefinition to stick. The result is a dead end for comic book publishing as a business. How would I change this? I'd cancel every existing superhero comic book and publish a limited new line for middle grade readership, simplify characters and storylines, and eliminate every event that requires more than passing familiarity with the basic simplified continuity, 10 to 15 titles. And then so we're pretty much here at the end of the thread, and that's interesting. And then you get Kurt Busiek chiming in. Why reach out to middle grade readers through a format designed for a distribution channel that barely exists? Why not go to them where they are today through graphic novels and Scholastic Book Club, etc.? DC is already doing that to a degree. And then Conway replies, it's a good argument for ending publication of monthly comics entirely. And then Kurt comes back with not until and unless you have the money coming in from your new approach to replace what you'd be throwing away. And making an abrupt switch isn't necessary or secure. Okay, so this is all good stuff. It's a good bit of history lesson. It's a good bit of insight from a legendary, I would say, it's arguable, but yeah, I would say a legendary creator who's been there and pretty much worked on every title that you can think of under the sun. And he's basically saying, what's the bluntest way I could put it is comics, when they started to hit big, were aimed at kids. And when the people who loved comics as a kid got old enough to be the creators themselves, what they did is they I guess you could say selfishly, they evolved the comics to be focused on older age groups to match themselves. In other words, they took the target demographic with them when they aged into becoming creators themselves, and therefore they sort of left the kids in the dust. I guess to be honest with you, I think I agree with that. What is his solution is you cancel every book, every title, and then refocus, retarget back to its origins, which is aimed at kids, and the kids will eventually become adults, and they pass it on to their kids as well. Get back to your roots, get back to your origins. To a certain degree, I agree with that. I think there's merit to doing that because those original runs are still talked about to this day. There's definitely, you have other arguments you need to make there. This is definitely a simplified approach. The other arguments would be, well, the quality of the writing today is not what it was back then. That's for darn sure. And I'll make a strong case for anybody who wants to push back on that one. There is no legendary creator today that you would stack up against a Kirby or even a Conway, if we're talking about Gerry Conway here, or George Perez or any of those creators. There's just nobody around today that exists that stacks up against those legendary creators. Just the quality of the creator pool, talent pool, is just not there. So that's a part of the problem as well. Should they just cut every title and just refocus back down to that middle grade ledger? I think, and this is probably the biggest part where I disagree with Gerry here, is I don't have a problem with doing that. I think that's fine. I think, though, you want to do both. You don't want you can create that middle grade tier or refocus back to the middle grade tier, but also have something for the adults or the upper YA groups to hang on to and to get involved with. I don't see that I think that's the main disagreement I have with his thread is it doesn't need to be either or. I think you can do both. And of course, and you say, well, what kind of model is that? How is that possible? How would that even succeed? And the answer is they're already doing that. If you look at manga, which is the same argument that so many people have been making for years now. Manga does that. They create books that focus on very specific, not ultra specific, but very specific enough age demographics. From shonen is pretty much in that middle grade tier that he's talking about. Shonen might be a little bit older, but seinen is definitely where you get into the upper range. So if you look at the progression of comic books like the early 60s and 70s, that was the younger grade stuff. That was the equivalent of maybe a Dragon Ball Z or a Naruto. But then when you get into the older stuff, that's when, or One Piece. When you get into the older stuff, that's where you see things like Berserk or Castlevania or those kinds of things so it's not the same characters, it's not the same titles, but there's something for each range. Manga does that really well. They've been doing that for years. They outsell the United States on a month-for-month basis by multiple 10x factors. So I think he's on the right track. I think he just doesn't give you a complete enough picture. So if DC and Marvel were to kind of recast their line and have a line of comics that was middle grade, and perfect example, let's take Marvel. If they did middle grade, targeted, toned, and sort of adapted books and writers that are good in that range, and let's say they did like Young Avengers, and it's Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, it's Miles Morales, Spider-Man, characters that are already young, so they have an appeal for younger readers, and just focus those books in that age range, and then keep them there. That's their on-ramp, and I think that would work really well. And then as those readers get a little bit older and they want a little bit more of a mature story, where that's where you get the full-on Avengers. That's where you get the individual Iron Man titles, where the middle grade is focused on Riri Williams as Ironheart, and then when you get into the older ranges, that's when you get Tony Stark, who is recovering alcoholic, womanizer, has all kinds of personal narcissistic personality flaws. And I think you can make those distinctions. You can make that separation. And so I think it's not that I necessarily agree with Gerry, as I think you take what he has and then you do both. And right now DC's kind of playing it with their YA novels, with their YA stuff. But their YA novels are hit or miss, and they're very out of continuity. So when and they're not necessarily even superhero focused. They're just sort of like young teen kid adventure type stuff, but they're definitely not superhero focused. So they kind of get it, but they kind of don't. They're just sort of using the names of the characters, but doing nothing superheroish in any way. But yeah. So there we are. There we have it. The interesting perspective from an industry comics writer legend who's been around forever. I think I largely agree with his stuff. The only place where I would disagree is I think his model doesn't go a little far enough. And if the DC and Marvel, again, and it sounds like a broken record, adapted more of a manga model, where you have younger and middle grade readers and their own titles that are very specific to them, using characters that are very sort of appealing and relatable to them. And then as those readers age up, then you get into the Avengers. Then you get into Justice League Dark and all these other things where you can have more mature themes, where you can have the characters acting in a more mature way that's relatable specifically to them. I'm fairly confident that model would do very well, but it would require investment. It would require strategic thought, and it's for darn sure would require hiring better writers than are largely available today. That's for darn sure. Is that going to happen? I don't know. We'll see. The next 6 months to a year will be, I think, a watershed moment for the monthly comics market, and we'll see how it shakes out by this time next year. So anyway, this was, I thought, interesting. Wanted to talk about it a little bit. Hopefully this has been informational and maybe somewhat interesting to you. And if you haven't already, please like, share, comment, subscribe down in the comment section below. If you thought this was interesting, give me a comment. Let me know how you thought it was interesting. Or if you have alternate ideas about Gerry's model here, let me know that as well. Also, if you think this is a terrible idea, if you think I'm off on completely the wrong direction, let me know as well. Give me that thumbs down too. Your interaction really helps the channel grow. It helps me to understand what the viewers are looking for, and it helps me make this channel better. Very much appreciate it. And again, as always, if you haven't already, please click on the link down in the description for the Comical Opinions newsletter. I'll be putting out newsletters on a periodic basis to do deep dive articles on some of this stuff, and maybe talk about things in more of a broader context with a little bit more research and backing, and we'll see how that goes as well. So I very much appreciate you if you subscribe, and there'll be some perks in the future, but you only get them if you subscribe. So this is Gabe Hernandez for Comical Opinions. I thank you very much for your time, and you have a great day.